We have with us today at the studio Paul Collier, who is the professor of economics at the University of Oxford and also director of the African Center for Economic Studies. Welcome, Paul.
Thanks.
Africa is actually held up as a kind of poster child for all that is wrong with globalization. Now, why is it that Africa has failed so abysmally in benefiting from globalization, which has helped countries in East Asia, particularly China and Southeast Asia and India, actually to grow so fast?
Yeah, well, Africa is a big place, and it doesn't make much sense to talk about it as just one entity. But let's try a radical simplification and put it into three groups. Three groups defined by different opportunities. And approximately a third of Africa's population is in each group. And they go like this. 1/3 is countries that are defined by having resource wealth, a lot of natural resources. Another third is countries that don't have resource wealth, but at least are coastal. And then the final third is countries that neither have resource wealth nor are coastal. Right?
Now, what's the significance of coastal?
Okay. The countries that don't have resource wealth but are coastal had and still have, to an extent, the opportunity to develop in the way that we understand best in the rest of the world, which is basically breaking into labor-intensive either manufactures or services and selling them on global markets. Africa, like India and China 20 years ago, has a huge amount of labor that has very low incomes. And when globalization works well, it provides the opportunity to convert that labor into products that use a lot of labor, and that way people drive up their incomes. The great advantage of that process is that because the world market in labor-intensive goods is huge relative to the size of coastal Africa, if African countries could break into these markets, they could grow like Topsy.
Now, Madagascar, I suppose, is the only success story in that area, right?
It's just starting to be a success story. Mauritius is the example of an African country that has dramatically transformed itself from a dirt-poor sugar island to an upper-middle-income country. Right? They did it pretty fast. The tragedy is it's the only story. Right? As you say, Madagascar is starting to do that. It's had a lot of political obstacles within Madagascar. The export processing zone that got established very quickly generated 300,000 jobs, which was a lot in a population of only 15 million. And then there was an election. The former president, who lost, wouldn't step down. He blockaded his own port for 8 months. And if you're running an export processing zone and the port is blockaded, you're dead.
So this political instability, is that a factor in?
It's one factor. More commonly, I think what happened is, if we go back, the big opportunity for Africa to have broken into these markets was in the 1980s. Why the 1980s? Because back in the 1980s, Asia wasn't already firmly established in these markets. Now, China's established in manufacturing markets, India in the services markets. Both of them have benefited from agglomerations, specialized agglomerations of these activities, which have lowered their costs. And so it's a harder game for Africa to play. 20 years ago, it could have been a level playing field. It could have broken in. And what stopped Africa, a number of things stopped it, but I think above all, coastal Africa happened to have a variety, what we call syndromes of poor policies of various forms. Economic control regimes in some countries, looting by narrow elites in other countries. that basically precluded the rather footloose export activities that were driven away either because the costs were too high or the risks were too high. A lot of those syndromes have gone. The last decade or so has been a period of substantial reform in Africa, but in a way it's missed the boat. That now Asia's established, Africa isn't. Why things have gone all right in Madagascar recently, sort of all right, is thanks to AGOA, the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act
of the United States.
Of the United States, which effectively provided protection for Africa against Asia in US markets. The European Union has something a bit similar called the Everything But Arms. And the problem with both these schemes is that although they've already conceded the principle that Africa needs some protection from Asia in these markets, they fail on detail. AGOA fails because it's much too short term. It's granted for just a 3-year window at a time. And so what's happening at the moment in Madagascar is the export firms are hugely profitable. They daren't expand. Because if they expand and AGOA is not renewed, they've sunk a lot of costs and...
so they don't want to take the risk.
That's right, that's right. Everything But Arms is a different set of problems. Like a lot of things with the European Union, it's a massive, immensely complicated rules of origin in particular. It's very limited in scope. It only covers the least developed countries. What I've been urging, and I think it's a big opportunity for the G8 this summer, is to combine the best of AGOA and Everything But Arms, try and bring the Japanese in as well, have an OECD-wide temporary protection scheme for Africa against Asia. How temporary? I'd say target 2015, that's the horizon for the Millennium Development Goals. Let's say we phase out all that protection by 2015, Africa has a decade to get to break into these markets.
No, but already, for instance, this removal of textile quota is hurting African textile industry.
That's right, that's right. So that Africa's taking a big hit, and it needs to have this offsetting temporary advantage. Now, all that is to do with the third of Africa that could realistically break into these global markets. The countries that have a lot of natural resource wealth realistically probably can't. Because
isn't that ironic? The countries which have resources.
Well, the explanation is basically Dutch disease. Right?
Explain that, please.
Okay, so what we mean by Dutch disease is that because the country's got a lot of foreign exchange earnings coming from natural resources, that makes other export activities uncompetitive, right? Unprofitable within the country. The country's already got the export earnings it needs
from
diamonds, oil, bauxite, whatever, phosphates. It's not, the Dutch disease is called Dutch disease because it first happened in the Netherlands with North Sea gas leading to the contraction of Dutch manufacturing activities. It's not absolutely inevitable. Indonesia managed to combine oil with manufacturing export expansion because it used the oil money very intelligently to lower the costs for manufacturing. So it's not a complete no-no, but it makes life much more difficult for these export breakthroughs. But globalization still really, really matters with this natural resource wealth, because what's happened in Africa to date has been that the pattern of extraction, of resource extraction, has been very corrupting of governance. the way the contracts have been negotiated in the first place has been corrupt. The revenues that have been paid have been completely non-transparent. The structure of risks has left the countries with very volatile revenue flows, and the companies protected. This cocktail has massively undermined governance, and so you get the paradox that the countries with the biggest revenue inflows have actually achieved the least in basic public service delivery.
But
Now,
is this situation a result of the kind of colonial rule, the type of colonial administration existed? Is a continuation of that colonial administration?
no, I think we blame too much on colonialism. It's and a lot of my African friends would say the same, that Africans have got to take responsibility for African outcomes. The group of Africans that particularly have to take responsibility are a pretty limited bunch of dictators for much of the 1980s. In the 1990s, Africa democratized, and sadly, even in the democracies, the cocktail of resource wealth, resource rents, and democracy didn't work out very well, because what it tended to do was subvert the democratic process. Democracy turned into a patronage game, patronage politics, instead of parties competing to deliver services to the mass of the population. We saw that in a couple of episodes, for example, of democracy in Nigeria. What democracy tended to mean was electoral competition, and that didn't have very good effects. Now, of course, that's not the only thing we mean by democracy. In a full democracy, we also mean checks and balances. Turns out, empirically, statistically, that in the countries with lots of resource rents, checks and balances are really important in getting growth and poverty reduction. The instant democracies we saw in Africa in the 1990s were instant electoral competition. You can hold an election anywhere, even in Afghanistan, right? What you can't do instantly is build these checks and balances. And they haven't been built in Africa. The present reforming government in Nigeria is trying to put in place those checks and balances, and it's a very brave and difficult struggle.
But in order to build these checks and balances, build institutions, you need a sort of middle class. And from what I gathered, that middle class is still very, very tiny.
Yeah, and so what you're saying is don't start from here. Now, the other thing you could be saying is, well, that gives the international community a role, globalization a role. Globalization can't just mean let's go in and buy the resources from whichever crook will sell it to us most cheaply, right? Globalization, responsible globalization, has got to mean we help the weak group in Africa, the small, weak middle class, as it were, and the silent poor, to get these checks and balances in place. It's our responsibility to help that. There's starting to be an initiative. To its credit, the British government launched this Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which came out of a very good NGO movement, Global Witness, Publish What You Pay. And what that's trying to do is get some integrity into these resource revenues.
So this is one positive aspect of globalization, that NGOs, international NGOs, are getting involved in bringing some transparency. And
a lot of what NGOs do vis-a-vis Africa is really dumb. Africa needs all the help it can get from people who care about it. And more than half the time, in my view, the people who care about Africa are pushing for the wrong things. In this case, one little NGO made a big impact, or started to make a big impact, pushing on the right thing. The corporate social responsibility agenda for the extractive industries in Africa should be governance, governance, governance. Most of the time at the moment, the corporate social responsibility agenda that's been pushed has been the wrong agenda. It's been labor standards and the environment. I don't mean to say they count for nothing, but they're trivial issues compared with getting the governance of these massive resource rents, which are vastly bigger than the aid flows to Africa, and at the moment are positively dysfunctional. That's where the corporate social responsibility action needs to be.
But before you can actually enforce corporate social responsibility, first of all, you need to stop the civil war, which is perhaps affecting most of these resource-rich countries. Is that right? The civil war in resource-rich countries.
It's affecting some of them. The problem of civil war is really a cocktail of risks. There's no one thing which says this is the cause, right? I think of countries as being prone to civil war if they have a few characteristics. I've found, in fact, that the characteristics which really matter turn out to be economic. Right? A lot of the attention's on the politics, but it's actually a lethal economic cocktail of three things. One is poverty, just low income. Second thing is economic decline. So not just the level of income, but the rate of change. If you're in economic decline, the risks go up a lot, I suppose because there's no hope, especially for young people. And the third risk factor is indeed the natural resources. Partly it's an attractive resource to fight over, partly it actually helps to finance the conflict. You can get away with any one of those, but if you've got all three of them, you're living dangerously. You're playing Russian roulette. And maybe you can play Russian roulette successfully for a long time. And then if the wrong chamber comes round, these civil wars typically, once they've started, are very hard to stop. Even when they stop, there's about a 50% risk that you go back into conflict within the next decade. And so there's what I call a conflict trap. Mm-hmm. You live dangerously before, you fall off the cliff because you've got this lethal cocktail, and then you're stuck for a long time.
And so these are the kind of failed state that you have been studying recently, your recent study on the failed states. If you could tell us as to how do you define a failed state?
Yeah, I think there are actually two categories, really. I mean, one we've just talked about is the states that are visibly failing because they're in civil war. Mm. Another category is failing states that are at peace, but they're still failing. Who are they failing? It's not they're failing us. They're failing their own citizens by having some cocktail of bad policies, bad institutions, bad governance, which condemns them to both low incomes and economic decline. Now, those characteristics also feed onto a risk of war, but it's a slightly different phenomenon, the failing states at peace.
Now, the failed states, as you said, that they're failing their own citizens, but they're failing the world as well. And this is what I think perhaps it would be useful for you to explain as to why does it matter to the US or anybody that states in Africa are failing?
Yeah, there are ripple effects that spill over from state failure. And you can think of it as layers. The first layer beyond the country itself is the neighborhood. And that's a big ripple effect. The more of the costs of both of civil war and of failing states that stay at peace, more of the costs are inflicted on neighbors than are inflicted on the country
how?
itself.
By migration?
Well, it's a mixture. It's a neighborhood effect which reduces economic activity, so growth is hit across the region. There's a big impact on migration, and that migration typically spreads disease. And so one massive effect is an increase in mortality rates. For example, the spread of malaria. Right? So you've got powerful neighborhood effects. These costs are highly persistent even when conflicts are over and economies reform, because health states or disease vectors are highly persistent. So a lot of the costs, and some of my analysis, most of the costs of a civil war occur after it's over. Right? You get a peace, but you're still paying for this conflict. But we've so far only looked at the neighborhood ripple. There are big costs that ripple not just to neighbors, they come right across the Atlantic and they come here. Right? Let me point to, I guess, three of them. One is the health costs. Disease doesn't know boundaries, right? Germs don't need a passport. There's reasonably good evidence that the global pandemic of AIDS came out of an African civil war. Simple reason is that in civil war you get a combination of two phenomena which spread sexually transmitted disease massively. One is mass rape, because you've got a lot of armed combatants under very poor control. So mass rape and mass population movement. And that cocktail spreads sexually transmitted disease. So there's a reasonable case that the World AIDS pandemic came out of one African civil war. If we could have averted that, just think of the benefits to mankind. Right? The second area is drugs, hard drugs. Right? Hard drugs are an enormous problem both for America and Europe. The costs are astounding because of the link between hard drugs and criminality.
So drugs are being produced in these countries?
Something like 95% of world production of hard drugs is in civil war environments or post-civil war environments. And there's a very simple reason for that. To produce hard drugs, you need territory outside the control of a recognized government. Inadvertently, or possibly deliberately, that is what is generated by civil wars. In fact, you get rebel movements which evolve to become drug baronies. Right? Reasonable interpretation of what's been going on in Colombia is that some of the rebel groups have evolved into drug baronies with a veneer of politics. So, drugs, disease, drugs, and then the third, which is the more speculative, is safe havens for terrorism and finance for terrorism. Was no fluke that Al-Qaeda held up in Afghanistan, which was at that time a failing state civil war environment. After all, the 9/11 terrorists weren't actually Afghani. They moved to Afghanistan because it offered them a safe haven of territory outside the control of a recognized government. So there's some evidence tracing financing for Al-Qaeda to the civil wars in West Africa, diamonds and stuff. So there's a security dimension to this, as well as a disease dimension and an economic dimension.
And the crime, that especially financial scams, that's, I think, Nigeria is kind of almost a world capital, isn't it? Yes. I mean, the present reform government is really trying to clean that up. But basically, both criminals, terrorists, and germs want territory outside the control of an effective state. In the modern world, there aren't many of these such havens. It would be a feasible goal
to say, over the next 20 years, let's get rid of all of them, right? The instrument for that doesn't have to be military. Right?
Yep.
There are actually more cost-effective ways of transforming states than invading them.
So you just concluding thought, what are you going to see in Africa in the next 10, 15 years? Because you said that in terms of manufacturing export, Africa's case is now very weak vis-a-vis Asia. It's going to be very difficult.
Yeah, I think what we're going to see is differentiation. I think we'll see some African countries turning around, breaking through into the sort of high growth rates we've seen in Asia. Africa has a lot of countries.
Like what?
Let's take Ghana, Senegal, Madagascar, Tanzania, would all be examples of countries with coastal locations that could make a credible thrust into global markets. Right? Then I think we'll see another group of countries turning around the management of their natural resource wealth. They've already got a great model, which is Botswana. Botswana, an African democracy which managed to build the checks and balances which made its resource wealth really valuable for its population. For many years, Botswana was not just the fastest growing economy in Africa, it was the fastest growing economy on earth. It moved from dirt poverty to middle income status, and it moved fast. Right? That's the model that Nigerians, who are now trying to implement reform, are trying to pick up. They're trying to turn Nigeria into a big Botswana. It's not easy, right? They're heroes. They're receiving death threats from the rent seekers who want to stop that, right? Because it's not going to benefit everybody. But we're going to see some successes like that. Once we've got some successes, we're going to see all sorts of pressures, the power of example, the power of protest, the power of international standards, spreading those examples across Africa. Yeah.
Well, with that positive note, thank you, Paul Collier, for visiting us and for this very fascinating interview.
Thank you very much indeed.